Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that you might not have thought about before, the role of financial services in tackling gambling harms. And we'll be looking at a 2024 policy note called Shining a Light. And you might be surprised by how much insight banks actually have into gambling behaviors. It's
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah, it is. It's quite a bit.
Yeah, and it makes you think about their potential to help and maybe even their responsibility. But before we get into all that, I guess let's just set the scene. How big of a problem are we actually talking about here?
Well, the 2023 gambling survey for Great Britain gives us a good place to start.
Uh,
It found that 2.5% of people surveyed were experiencing problem gambling, with another 11.9% at risk. But here's where it gets really interesting. Among those who gambled in the past year, excluding the lottery, that number jumps to a staggering 32%.
wow, 32%. So we're talking more than triple the initial figure. Makes you think there's a lot more to this than meets the eye.
Yeah, and these figures are likely just the tip of the iceberg. Admitting you have a gambling problem can be incredibly difficult. There's still so much stigma surrounding it, so many people suffering in silence, either afraid or ashamed to seek help. So it's highly likely that a lot of people don't even disclose their struggles to their loved ones, let alone participate in a survey.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's where this whole idea of hidden harms, visible data comes into play, right? I have to admit, the idea that my bank might know more about my gambling than I do is a little unsettling.
I understand that reaction, but it's not about banks spying on people. It's about recognizing that they have this unique vantage point.
Hmm.
You know, every time you make an online gambling transaction, it leaves a digital footprint that banks can see. They have real-time insight into your spending habits, the frequency of your gambling, and even potential red flags like,
So, like if you're consistently gambling before paying your rent or constantly dipping into your overdraft.
exactly. Those are the kinds of patterns that could indicate a problem. And the report argues that banks can use this data not to judge or punish, but to identify individuals who might be at risk and offer support. Imagine if your bank reached out to you not to scold you for your spending, but to offer resources and guidance before things spiraled out of control.
Okay, I'm starting to see how powerful this could be. But do banks actually have a responsibility to act on this information?
That's a key question. And it's one that the Financial Conduct Authority, or FCA, is starting to grapple with. Their new consumer duty mandates that financial institutions have to proactively work to prevent foreseeable harm, including gambling-related financial issues. We're also seeing a rise in gambling-related complaints to the Financial Ombudsman Service. All of this is putting pressure on banks to go beyond simply offering gambling blocks and start thinking more holistically about how they could support customers who might be struggling.
So it's not just about reacting to problems after the fact, it's about actually trying to prevent them. That's a big shift. But before we get into what those solutions might look like, I think it's important to step back and really understand the human cost of gambling. We can talk about statistics and data all day, but ultimately, this is about real people's lives.
I agree. And the Shining a Light report does a good job of highlighting this. It draws on a survey from the money and mental health research community. And some of the quotes from people who have experienced gambling harms are really heartbreaking. You hear people talk about gambling as an escape from financial hardship, a way to cope with stress or anxiety. But the irony, of course, is that it almost always makes things worse.
Yeah, the report shares a quote from one person, and I think it's pretty powerful. They said, "I didn't have any help from the bank at all. I now bank with a different company." Mm, it's a quiet statement. But it speaks volumes about the shame and secrecy surrounding this issue. And it makes you wonder how many others have done the same, just slipped away silently rather than risk judgment or scrutiny.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it really underscores the need for more sensitive, non-judgmental support systems. Systems that don't make people feel like they have to choose between their financial well-being and their privacy.
So we've talked about the scale of the problem, the data that banks have access to, and the very real human cost of gambling harms. Let's move on to what banks are already doing to address this issue. I know a lot of them offer gambling blocks now, right?
They do. And that's a good starting point.
Yeah.
But as the Shining a Light report points out, it's a reactive measure,
Mm-hmm.
and it's often too little too late.
So just blocking transactions isn't enough. What else could banks be doing?
Well, the report lays out 9 specific recommendations for how financial services can play a more active role in preventing gambling harms. And what's really interesting is they go way beyond simply blocking transactions.
All right, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. What are some of the key takeaways our listeners should know about?
One of the most promising recommendations is the idea of using transaction data to proactively identify at-risk customers. This involves developing algorithms that can analyze spending patterns and flag individuals who might be exhibiting signs of problem gambling.
Wait, algorithms. Explain that to me. How would that actually work?
Imagine an algorithm that can recognize patterns like consistently gambling right after payday or before paying essential bills, or maybe an algorithm that picks up on a sudden increase in gambling frequency or the amount of money being spent. Banks could then use this information to reach out to these customers and offer support, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that feels helpful and supportive.
Okay, so instead of just waiting for someone to hit rock bottom and ask for help, banks could actually step in and intervene before things get too bad. That's a powerful concept.
It is, and it speaks to a fundamental shift in how we think about the role of financial institutions. Instead of simply managing money, they can become active participants in promoting financial well-being.
I'm starting to see how this could be a game changer. But let's be realistic. There must be some challenges to implementing these recommendations, right?
Absolutely. There are definitely hurdles to overcome, particularly when it comes to things like data privacy and collaboration.
Yeah, data privacy is a big one. No one wants to feel like their bank is spying on them or judging their choices.
Exactly. And that's why the report stresses the importance of transparency and consent. Banks need to be upfront with customers about how they're using their data and give them the option to opt out of any data-driven interventions. It's about striking a balance between protecting privacy and preventing harm.
That makes sense. So what about collaboration? Who else needs to be involved in this?
Well, for these interventions to be truly effective, banks can't operate in a silo. They need to work closely with gambling operators, regulators, and support organizations.
So we're talking about sharing data and best practices, coordinating interventions, and making sure there's a clear pathway for customers to get the help they need.
Exactly. It's about creating a more integrated approach to tackling gambling harms, one that recognizes the shared responsibility of all stakeholders.
This is all starting to sound pretty complex. Are banks really equipped to handle all of this?
It's a legitimate question. Implementing these recommendations will require investment, innovation, and a willingness to embrace new ways of thinking. But the potential benefits are significant, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
All right, let's dive into those benefits. What kind of impact could we realistically see if these recommendations were implemented?
Well, for starters,
Right.
we could potentially see a reduction in the number of people experiencing gambling harms. Early intervention is key in so many areas, and it's likely to be just as important here.
That makes sense. If you can catch people before they fall too deep into the hole, you have a much better chance of helping them climb back out.
Exactly. And then there's the potential for financial savings. Gambling harms cost the UK billions of pounds every year, both in terms of direct losses and the indirect costs associated with things like debt, bankruptcy, and crime. If we can prevent even a small percentage of those harms, the economic benefits could be substantial.
Wow, I hadn't even considered the economic impact. But beyond just the numbers, there's also the human impact, right? The families and communities
Yeah,
that are affected by gambling harms.
absolutely. The ripple effects of gambling addiction can be devastating. It can strain relationships, lead to job loss, and even contribute to homelessness. By addressing gambling harms, we're not just helping individuals, we're helping to strengthen entire communities.
Okay, so we've got a compelling case for why this is important. But what about the feasibility? Is it realistic to think that banks can actually pull this off?
Well, there are definitely challenges, but I think it's important to remember that banks are already collecting and analyzing vast amounts of data about their customers. They're using this data to make decisions about things like loan approvals and credit limits. It's not that big of a leap to start using it to identify and support customers who might be at risk of gambling harm.
So the infrastructure is already there. It's just a matter of using it differently.
Exactly. And I think there's a growing recognition within the financial services industry.
Yeah.
They have a responsibility to go beyond just managing money and start thinking more holistically about customer well-being. The FCA's consumer duty is a clear indication of this shift in thinking.
So it's not just about profits anymore. It's about actually considering the broader social impact of their actions.
Exactly. And I think that's a positive development, but of course the devil is in the details. Implementing these recommendations will require careful planning, collaboration, and a willingness to learn and adapt along the way.
All right, so we've laid out the problem, the potential solutions, and some of the challenges. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of how these recommendations could actually be put into practice.
Great idea. Let's start by taking a closer look at how banks could use data analysis and algorithms to identify at-risk customers.
And let's also make sure we connect this back to the listener. Why should they care? What's the relevance of all this to their own lives?
Absolutely. After all, this is a deep dive for you, the listener. We want you to walk away from this conversation feeling informed and empowered to think critically about the role of financial services in addressing this often hidden problem.
Exactly. So buckle up because things are about to get really interesting.
Let's imagine you're a bank and you're trying to identify potential problem gamblers among your customers. You don't want to be Big Brother, but you do want to be able to offer help to those who might need it.
Okay, so where do you even begin? It's not like there's a giant red flag on someone's account that says problem gambler.
Right? It's much more nuanced than that. And that's where the data analysis comes in. Banks are already collecting tons of information about your transactions, where you're spending money, how often, what time of day, and so on. The Shining a Light report suggests using this data to create algorithms that can detect patterns associated with problem gambling.
Okay, hold on. Algorithms, it all sounds very Minority Report to me. Can you give me a concrete example of how this would actually work?
Sure. Let's say you're looking at someone's spending patterns. The algorithm might notice that they consistently gamble immediately after getting paid before they've even covered their essential bills. Or maybe it picks up on a sudden increase in the frequency of their gambling transactions, or a significant jump in the amount of money they're spending. These could be early warning signs that someone is heading down a dangerous path.
So the algorithm is basically acting like a really sophisticated early warning system, flagging potential problems before they become full-blown crises.
Exactly. And the beauty of this approach is that it's proactive. Instead of waiting for someone to hit rock bottom and come asking for help, the bank can reach out to them first, offering support and resources at a stage when they're more likely to be receptive.
I can see how this could be really valuable. But wouldn't people feel like their privacy is being violated? I mean, no one wants their bank judging their every purchase.
That's a valid concern, and it's something that the report addresses directly. It emphasizes that any data-driven interventions must be implemented with transparency and consent.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice? Are we talking about banks sending out emails saying, hey, we've noticed you've been gambling a lot lately, want some help?
Not quite. It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
The report suggests that banks should be upfront with customers about how they're using their data, perhaps even offering them the option to opt into a program where their transactions are monitored for potential gambling harms.
So it's about giving people control over their own data and letting them choose whether or not they want to participate in these programs.
Exactly. And it's also about ensuring that any interventions are sensitive and non-judgmental.
Okay, so let's say someone does opt into this program. What kind of support could the bank actually offer?
Well, it could start with something as simple as providing information about responsible gambling resources. They could direct people to helplines, websites, or support groups. They could also offer financial counseling, helping people to create budgets and manage their debt.
So it's about connecting people with the resources they need to get back on track.
Yes, and it's also about helping them to develop healthier financial habits.
You know, it's striking me that we're essentially talking about banks becoming more like financial therapists.
That's a great analogy. And I think it reflects a broader trend within the financial services industry. There's a growing recognition that their role goes beyond simply managing transactions.
It's about actually helping people to achieve financial well-being.
Precisely. And that includes addressing issues like gambling addiction, which can have a devastating impact on people's lives.
Okay, so we've talked about how banks could use data analysis to identify at-risk customers and offer support. But let's not forget about the other stakeholders involved. The report also emphasizes the need for collaboration between banks, gambling operators, regulators, and support organizations, right?
Absolutely. This can't be a solo mission for banks.
So how could this collaboration actually work? What would it look like in practice?
Well, for starters, there needs to be better data sharing between banks and gambling operators. If a gambling operator notices that someone is exhibiting signs of problem gambling, they could share that information with the person's bank, who could then offer support.
That would make sense, but wouldn't that raise privacy concerns? I mean, people might not be comfortable with their gambling data being shared with their bank.
You're right. It would have to be done very carefully with appropriate safeguards in place to protect people's privacy. It would also require clear consent from the individual involved.
So it's not just about sharing data willy-nilly, it's about creating a system that is both effective and ethical.
Exactly. And it's also about ensuring that there's a clear pathway for people to get the help they need. For example, if a bank reaches out to someone who they believe might be struggling with gambling, they need to be able to connect them with appropriate support services.
So banks would need to have a good understanding of the resources that are available and be able to make referrals to the right organizations.
Exactly. And that's where collaboration with support organizations becomes crucial. Banks could partner with organizations that specialize in gambling addiction treatment and prevention, drawing on their expertise to ensure that customers are getting the best possible care.
It's starting to sound like a really comprehensive approach, one that involves a whole network of different players working together.
It is. And it really highlights the fact that tackling gambling harms is a shared responsibility. It's not something that any one organization can do on their own.
It's interesting to think about the potential ripple effects of this kind of approach.
Mhm.
If banks start taking a more active role in promoting financial well-being, could that actually lead to broader societal change?
It's certainly possible. If we start thinking of financial institutions as partners in our well-being rather than just places to store our money, it could lead to a shift in how we view and manage our finances.
It's a paradigm shift, isn't it? We're talking about moving from a purely transactional relationship to one that is more holistic and human-centered.
Exactly. And I think that's a really exciting possibility. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There are still a lot of challenges to overcome before we get there.
All right, let's talk about those challenges. Data privacy we've touched on, but what are some of the other hurdles that banks might face in implementing these recommendations?
One of the biggest challenges will be ensuring that any interventions are actually effective. It's not enough to simply throw resources at the problem. We need to make sure that the programs and services that banks offer are evidence-based and tailored to the needs of individuals struggling with gambling addiction.
So it's not just about good intentions, it's about making sure that those intentions translate into real, tangible outcomes.
Exactly. And that will require rigorous evaluation and a willingness to adapt and improve over time.
So it's a process of continuous learning and improvement.
Absolutely. And it will also require ongoing research to better understand the nature of gambling harms and the most effective ways to prevent them.
That makes sense. We need to keep up with the evolving landscape of gambling, which is constantly changing with the emergence of new technologies and products. But what about the cost? All of this sounds pretty expensive. Are banks really willing to invest the resources needed to make it happen?
That's a good question. It will undoubtedly require a significant investment, but I think there's a strong business case to be made.
Okay, lay it on me. How can banks justify spending money on this?
Well, for starters, there's the potential to reduce financial losses associated with gambling harms. If banks can help their customers avoid falling into debt or bankruptcy, it will ultimately benefit their bottom line.
So it's not just about altruism, it's about protecting their own financial interests as well.
Exactly. And then there's the potential to enhance their reputation and build stronger relationships with their customers.
By showing that they actually care about their customers' well-being.
Precisely.
Yeah.
In today's competitive market, banks need to differentiate themselves, and offering services that go beyond traditional banking products can be a powerful way to do that.
It seems like we're at a crossroads. Banks have this unique opportunity to step up and become leaders in promoting financial well-being, but they also face significant challenges in implementing these recommendations.
That's a great way to put it. It's a moment of both opportunity and uncertainty. But I think the Shining a Light report provides a valuable roadmap for how banks can navigate this complex landscape and make a real difference in the lives of their customers.
It all sounds very promising, but I still have some lingering questions, specifically about the role of government and regulators. I mean, banks can't solve this problem alone, right? What needs to happen at a policy level to really move the needle on gambling harms?
You're absolutely right. Banks are just one piece of the puzzle. To truly tackle this issue, we need strong government policies and regulations that address the root causes of gambling harms. Things like a statutory levy on gambling operators to fund research and support services and stricter rules around advertising and the design of gambling products themselves.
It's about creating a safer gambling environment overall, not just relying on banks to mop up the damage after the fact.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really important question for you, the listener. What role do you think the government should play in addressing gambling harms? What policies or regulations would you like to see implemented?
That's a great question to ponder as we move into the final part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring the broader societal and political context of gambling harms, and we'll challenge you to think critically about your own role in creating a safer and more responsible gambling landscape. So stay tuned. We've talked about a lot in this deep dive into gambling harms, from the surprising insights banks have into our spending habits, to the potential for data-driven interventions, and the crucial role of collaboration. But as we shift our focus to the bigger picture, I think it's time to address the elephant in the room, the government.
Absolutely. While banks can definitely play a significant role in mitigating gambling harms, they can't do it alone. We need strong government policies and regulations to create a truly safe and responsible gambling environment.
All right, let's get specific. What kind of government action are we talking about here? What needs to change at the policy level?
Well, one of the most significant proposals is the implementation of a statutory levy on gambling operators. This would essentially be a tax on their profits, with the funds being used to support research, treatment, and prevention programs related to gambling harms.
So instead of relying solely on voluntary contributions from the industry, we'd have a dedicated stream of funding to address the very problems that the industry itself is contributing to.
Exactly. It would create a more sustainable and accountable system for funding the services that are so desperately needed. And it would shift some of the burden away from taxpayers, who are currently footing a large portion of the bill for gambling-related harms.
That makes a lot of sense. But beyond just funding, what else could the government do to address, the root causes of gambling harms?
Well, one area that needs serious attention is advertising. Gambling ads are everywhere these days, on TV, online, even on public transportation. And they often target vulnerable groups, like young people and those struggling with financial difficulties. It's hard to escape them, that's for sure. But is it really the government's role to regulate advertising? Isn't that infringing on freedom of speech?
It's a valid question, and it's one that often sparks debate. But when it comes to products that can have such a detrimental impact on people's lives, I think it's reasonable to consider limitations on advertising, particularly when it comes to protecting vulnerable groups.
So we're talking about things like restricting the times when gambling ads can be shown, limiting their exposure to young people, or even banning certain types of marketing tactics that might be particularly exploitative.
Exactly. And it's not just about the quantity of advertising, it's also about the content. Many gambling ads are incredibly misleading, promising easy wins and downplaying the risks involved. The government could play a role in ensuring that advertising is more truthful and transparent, giving people a more realistic understanding of the potential downsides of gambling. That makes sense. It's about empowering people to make informed choices, rather than bombarding them with messages that prey on their vulnerabilities. But what about the gambling products themselves? Is there anything the government could do to make them safer?
Absolutely. The design of many modern gambling products, particularly online games, is incredibly addictive. They're designed to keep you playing for as long as possible, using sophisticated algorithms and psychological tricks to maximize profits. The government could intervene by setting limits on things like the speed of play, the maximum bet size, and the frequency of wins.
So it's about slowing down the game, reducing the potential for big losses, and making it less likely that people will get caught in a cycle of chasing their losses.
Exactly. And it's also about ensuring that affordability checks are more robust. Currently, it's far too easy for people to gamble more than they can afford, leading to financial ruin and other devastating consequences.
It's striking me that this whole conversation about gambling regulation is really a microcosm of a much larger debate about the role of government in our lives. Where do we draw the line between personal responsibility and collective action? When is it appropriate for the government to step in and protect people from themselves, even if it means infringing on individual liberties?
It's a complex question, and there are no easy answers. But I think it's important to remember that gambling addiction is a public health issue. It affects not just individuals, but families, communities, and society as a whole.
And just like with other public health issues like smoking or obesity, there's a role for both individual responsibility and government intervention. It's about creating an environment where people are empowered to make healthy choices, but also protected from predatory practices and harmful products.
Exactly. It's about striking a balance between freedom and responsibility.
So where do we go from here? We've laid out a lot of potential solutions both at the industry level and the government level, but how do we actually turn these ideas into action?
Well, that's where you come in, the listener. This deep dive has been all about equipping you with the knowledge and insights you need to think critically about this complex issue. Now it's up to you to decide what role you want to play in creating a safer and more responsible gambling landscape.
Maybe you're inspired to contact your elected officials and advocate for stricter gambling regulations. Or perhaps you'll choose to support organizations that are working to prevent gambling harms and provide support to those who are struggling.
You could even start a conversation with your friends and family about responsible gambling, helping to raise awareness and break down the stigma that often surrounds this issue.
Remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect. By speaking up, sharing information, and supporting positive change, you can contribute to a brighter future for everyone.
And that's what this deep dive has been all about. Empowering you, the listener, to be an informed and engaged citizen. Because ultimately, it's through collective action that we can create a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. If you're interested in learning more or getting involved, be sure to check out the resources we've linked in the show notes, including the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute and the Gambling Harms Action Lab.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.